Hello and welcome to Bloomberg Quint. You're watching Insolvency Diaries. India's insolvency regime is less than a year old, and the rules of the game have now been changed for the third time. Recently, the bankruptcy regulator notified its amended regulations. It was required after the government issued an ordinance amending the Insolvency Code last month. This time, the regulations have focused on streamlining the insolvency process and making it less prone to litigation. Have they succeeded? To answer that, I'm joined by Sapan Gupta, a bankruptcy law partner at Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas. Sapan, welcome to Insolvency Diaries. Sapan, it seems that the regulator has worked backwards from the 180 days timeline to lay down what activity should take how much time. For instance, the public announcement inviting claims must be made within 3 days of the interim resolution professional being appointed. Creditors can submit their claims only up to the 90th day of the process, and the resolution plans must be submitted by the 135th day. Do you believe that breaking the resolution process in this fashion would make it more robust, or any deviations from it would again make it subject to litigation?
Thank you, Payaswani, for having me. The regulations, of course, have been changed to give more clarity on the timelines. The public announcement always existed that you have to announce the CIR process commencement within 3 days of the order of NCLT. The other timelines on submission of claims. Earlier, the code said that you can submit your claim as long as the CIR process is on. Now they have said 14 days or up to 90 days RP may accept the claims. So they have still left the discretion with the resolution professional that he can go beyond 90 days, but the guidelines are that he should try and complete that in 90 days. And 90 days is also a timeline for inviting expression of interest, for accepting an invitation expression of interest, which means that they are trying to give a clear idea to the resolution applicant that what are the claims. So when he is preparing the plan, it also will allow RP to not to chase the creditors. We have seen in the earlier cases that a number of operational creditors, and in some cases claims by government, were not submitted in time, which led to delays in aggregating the total claims and then putting together the plan. So in that respect, yes, it is a very good move that some guidance has been given that people who are claiming against a corporate debtor who is in CIR must submit their claims in time.
Okay, so for instance, they have said that the creditors can submit their claims only up to the 90th day of the process. For instance, if a fresh creditor comes in with a fresh claim on the 91st day, can the resolution professional now use these amended regulations to say no thank you, and that will hold up in court?
So our reading is that the legislature or the IBBI have used the word may, which leaves a discretion with the resolution professional. But in practice and given the intent of the amendment, we will believe that the resolution professional will have the power to reject the claims if someone comes on 91st day.
Okay. So from the way resolution professionals have been running the insolvency process, Sapan, do you anticipate any practical challenges in sticking to these timelines?
Yes, so some of these are very strict timelines. Thankfully, it says model timelines in the time chart. The ones which are in the body of the regulations or in the ordinance will be compulsory, will be mandatory. But the others which are in the table of model timelines, RP will have some discretion to change those. Some are realistic, but it does not take into account the size of the corporate debtor. Sometimes the number of the claims could be so huge that 90 days may not be sufficient for the resolution professional and his team to verify and decide. And also on the plan, 135th day can be very, very tight for large cases. In addition to that, they have also said that when the resolution proposals have come, RP will do the due diligence in 10 days. And invite objections from the other resolution applicants. 10 days for due diligence can be a very, very little time to complete a proper diligence. Another provision is that within 75 days, RP has to decide on the avoidance transaction. When RP takes control, the first 30-35 days are gone in admitting the claims, doing the first COC, his own confirmation from IRP to RP, and then just giving 40-45 days to do an analysis of avoidance transactions, which are generally very complicated, may require more time. So yes, it's good to have a timeline, but RP should have more discretion in able to address the issues which are very particular to every account.
Sure, okay, and we'll have to wait and watch how this plays out over the next few months. There are also some changes to how creditors committee functions. Earlier, a vote on any agenda could happen if all the members of the COC are present. That requirement has been done away with. I'm assuming this is to have expedited decision making, but they've also allowed COC members to change their vote now. What has prompted this amendment, and could there be any unintended consequences of it to your mind?
Yes, so changing of votes has happened in certain cases. After the voting was done, some financial creditors went back and gave letters to the resolution professionals changing their votes. We had always strongly advised against this practice, that once voted, it's final. Now the physical can happen, which was always possible only if 100% of the COC was in attendance. And for various reasons, some of the COCs are very large, and now with some other creditors like authorized representative of home buyers is part of the COC, it may not be possible to always have 100% attendance. So by allowing to vote in a physical scenario can expedite the process. And there has been an option which has been kept, then electronic voting can also happen for the members who have not voted. But processes will have to be put in place, that people who have voted against people who have not voted, how do you maintain the confidentiality? Is it a secret vote? Is it an open vote? Are you entitled to vote after seeing how the others are voting? So the purpose of e-voting was that the others were not able to see what you are voting, and the final outcome was available at one go. Now part physical, part electronic may lead to that confusion, and people may just want to see that how the other creditors are voting in a COC, which may lead to some practical confusion on the ground.
Okay, and what do you make of the provision or the regulation that has been now amended to allow COC members to change their vote?
Now changing the votes is sometimes the decisions are taken not at appropriate level or without understanding. What are the timelines, that in what time frame can they change the vote will have to be seen. Can they delay the decision making? Frankly, there was no need for allowing that, because if creditors are there and they have come up with an authority to vote, then why should a provision be given to change the vote, except in certain exigencies which could have been defined properly, that what could be those exigencies. Otherwise, the earlier system of voting, other than some instances where the vote was changed after vote has been done, was working very well on an electronic platform.
Okay, all right. Sapan, there were also two changes that most stakeholders were expecting would come in the amended regulations. One was that late bids won't be accepted and late bidders won't be entertained. Did this need a categorical mention, because I couldn't find one in the regulations, or is it implicit now that we have strict timelines for all the steps in the insolvency process?
Yes, so there is no explicit provision, but we are reading that late bids will not be allowed. The plans have to be submitted electronically, and it has been written in one of the regulations that if plans are submitted after the date which has been set by RP, the plan can be rejected. So our reading is that the late bids can be now rejected by resolution professional. which will help in solving these cases in a time-bound manner and reduce litigation. And it is a notice to people who are interested in these assets that if you are interested, please abide by the timeline, and you cannot take your own time. The process is 180 days or 270 days. Also, it covers the point that you are not bidding after seeing the bids of the other resolution applicant. So yes, guidelines can now be read in a way that the late applicants will not be entertained by resolution professional.
And then these timelines can become a ground for the resolution professional to perhaps argue if at all a late bidder takes the resolution professional to court on grounds that why my bid is being rejected.
Yes, now resolution professional will have power of the regulations, that he can say that I am acting under these regulations. In other cases, it was being argued that RP's responsibility and COC's responsibility is to maximize the value. So as long as the bids are coming between by 180 days or 270 days, they should consider those in the name of maximization of value, and there was no regulatory support that was available to RP and COC. On the other hand, it was written that the plan can be submitted at any point of time, or it could be read at 150 days. So yes, it is a very welcome change in that sense, and it will go a long way in keeping the timelines.
Okay, I'm glad you mentioned maximization of assets, Sapan. The second change that everyone was expecting had to do with giving the creditors committee a free hand in how they want to conduct the bidding process. Should it be an H1 process or an auction or any other method that leads to a better price discovery? That hasn't come in. Am I sort of missing something, or is it obvious now? Because the original press release on the ordinance mentioned this one sentence that got everyone's hopes up, that now COC can do, let's say, a Swiss auction or any other method, which now seems to doesn't, which is missing in the regulations. Where does that leave us on the bidding process front?
So the so-called H1, where most of the large assets or the top 12 are following, is a process which was agreed by the COCs on a case-to-case basis. And then it was generally followed across the industry. Now that
based on the procurement, that was based on the CVC procurement guidelines, right? Because everybody was following the H1 because of that procurement guidelines.
So that was one guiding factor for public sector banks, but that was not the only factor on going with the H1. The reason for H1 was that if you are putting your foot forward, then you should put your best foot forward in the first go. In the initial biddings, when the stakeholders were still debating whether H1 is the best way or not, we did see bids where the interested bidders put a lower bid because they wanted to test the water and then engage in negotiation and try and beat the applicant who was the highest. Now the structure of IBC is not only commercial. Yes, upfront cash recovery, etc., are very, very important parts of the plan, but the plan also needs to meet the criteria of going concern, feasibility and viability, and taking care of other stakeholders. So H1 alone was never the criteria. It was one of the important criteria of the evaluation metrics, and the whole metrics was drawn by the banks at a general level. Some of the stakeholders had a view that it may not help the banks in deriving the best value because you are negotiating only with H1. And then
also
there was a discussion over
some revised bids coming at higher levels, right?
Yes, some revised bid came at a higher level, and a number of those matters are pending before the adjudicating authority. But except a couple of cases, the banks or the COCs have stuck to H1 and they have negotiated. So you also have the power to negotiate with H1. It did not mean that you would simply say that whatever is H1 we will accept. So the discussion was around that part. Now the regulations are not covering it. In our view, rightly so, because it is a commercial decision of each creditor's committee, and regulations can give you a broad perspective that in what timelines you have to carry what, how do you accept the plan, what are the eligibility, and regulator has chosen not to get into the commercial aspects of the bidding process, so that the creditors are at their discretion to choose what they prefer most. So yes, there was a discussion, but it has not been clearly written in reg, which I think is good for stakeholders, because they can take a decision based on the viability of the asset, interest in the asset, and various other factors.
Sure, but the fear, I mean, you mentioned that the discretion was always there, but the fear among, and specifically the public sector banks, was that if you don't stick to the procurement guidelines of the CVC, you know, somebody may ask you questions later on in the process or once it gets over, and everybody was being safe and sticking to this H1 process. So are you saying now, and I think we did see one example in the case of Ruchi Soya, where I think the COC has gone the auction way. Are you, from the cases that perhaps you are close to, are you observing that the creditors committee is experimenting with more ways of price discovery than just the H1 process?
Yes, because public sector banks are not the only banks which were part of the decision. IBA has endorsed that decision in such form, and private banks are part of IBA, including the multinational banks. So it was a wider based decision than just public sector banks. Without getting into the specifics of the case, as I said, that you may have COCs where there is no public sector bank. You may have cases where only an asset reconstruction company is selling the asset. So they may not want to follow H1. Yes, there will be more experiments on how the bidding will be done. There have been cases where courts have directed that the two bidders can submit bids and COC can pick the best bid. So H1 to start with was a very good matrix, and it may continue, but it will not continue in all the cases.
Sure, exactly, and this is what I was trying to understand, that whether the lack of this explicit mention on the kind of processes that COC can undertake, does it tie the hands of the creditors at all? But as you mentioned, that perhaps not, and the COC members may be willing to experiment with more price discovery mechanisms than just H1. Sapan, thank you for joining us on Insolvency Diaries today, and perhaps pointing out some of the areas which the regulator hopes will make the insolvency code more resilient. Thank you so much for watching.